Welcome back to the Backcountry Hunters and Anglers Podcast and Blast. This is Hal Herring. We're sponsored now by Sitka Gear. Sitka's the sole sponsor of the Backcountry Hunters and Anglers Podcast and Blast. Anybody listening to this probably knows that Sitka products are designed to get you through any of the most radical situations in the backcountry, or in the duck marsh or on the river. So if you're not already acquainted with their products, please check that out. We're proud to be associated with them. I'd also like to invite all the listeners of the podcast to Backcountry Hunters and Anglers' 7th Annual Rendezvous. It's going to be the biggest gathering of conservation-minded hunters and anglers in our country. And this is happening April 12th through the 14th in Boise, Idaho. Meeting people like Stephen Ranella, Remy Warren, Randy Newberg, Hank Shaw. Hank's one of the best wild game cooks in the world. And you'll be able to rub shoulders with hundreds of other public land owners and public land sportsmen. It's always been a really good time. Tickets are on sale now, and they cover all kind of activities there. You've got the Brew Fest, the Camp Chef Cook-Off. There's all kind of seminars. What's growing in popularity has been the headlining storytelling event. It's just really a good time. It's not to be missed. If this is the kind of lifestyle you lead, your tickets are now available at backcountryhunters.org. Good morning. This is Backcountry Hunters and Anglers Podcast and Blast. I'm Hal Herring, and I'm here today with a good old friend of mine, Tony Bynum. Tony is, and I'll take the risk of embarrassing him here. I don't care. Tony's far and away one of America's best outdoor photographers. He's done some work that I simply is beyond my understanding, and the sheer range of what he's covered, not just in the United States but all over the world, from human beings interacting with the natural world to hunting, with an emphasis on hunting for sure, or fishing. But it's just a tremendous range, and it all comes straight out of some kind of wellspring of nature that is brought through in the photographs in a way that I just don't ever see with anybody else. So beyond that, I won't keep on dogging on you. I'm interested in, I know you're from Walla Walla, Washington originally. Mm-hmm. And you're on my side of the mountains and have been for 15, 16 years at East Glacier. Mm-hmm. So I wanted to, one of the things I think I've always been most interested in, and we hadn't talked about it that much, is just how did you get where you're at? Mm-hmm.
So I'm in East Glacier Park, and I ended up there like a lot of men end up in places. I ended up over in East Glacier based on a relationship with a woman. Ended up having a child, and so we ended up in East Glacier Park, where my the mother of my daughter's from. And photography had always been something I was entertained by, and I felt some connection to imagery, living in various parts of the country. And I tended to like to take photographs to try and make myself or help myself understand what was happening around me. And for some reason I could figure out in my own mind what was going on in the world around me with a photograph rather than just sitting there looking at it. It was really complicated, right? Like there's all this stuff going on, and with a photograph, it's a two-dimensional object, and when you're just standing around looking at stuff, there's all kinds of things going on. You're hearing stuff, and you're smelling stuff, and you're feeling it, and so for me, that was really complicated, and I just wanted to sort of boil things down to trying to understand specific little parts of the world, and so I was always driven by that. And my professional career after I went to college, and I ended up getting a master's degree in science and working in the resource management field, both for Indian tribes and for states and for locals and for the federal government and EPA in Washington, D.C. And I sort of got to the point where, my photography could tell a story in a way that all of that paperwork never could. It's frustrating to be working in a system, in a bureaucratic environment where, you're doing good work, you're doing good research, you're producing results, you're protecting environments, and you're measuring water quality and air quality, and you're doing all these fantastic things, but you never could really see the results.
So what brought you into that in the first place?
It was almost natural, I guess, for whatever the reason. As young as I can remember, trying to figure out the natural world. I think what really focused me, I always had this interest in being outside and being stressed out. Mm-hmm. And the outdoors will stress you out, right?
Right.
Like it was just a challenge in a sense. I'm going to go out there and get cold and wet and fall down and break stuff. And it was just nonstop challenge. But photographically and in the science part of that, I read a book. I don't know when it was. It was by Carl Sagan, and I think it was The Cosmos.
Okay.
And I've
never read that. I remember it.
Yeah, I think I must have been pretty young in high school or maybe middle school at the time when that book came out. And I read that book, and it sort of opened my mind to a number of things. But one is the size and scope of the world. The second part was, and it sort of was at the same time, was watching Marty Stauffer in Wild America and realizing at the same time I could take science and the world and actually, like there's a guy out there who is out there videotaping animals, and he's obviously doing that, making a living somehow. And at that point I thought, man, I'm going to make a living outdoors doing something. So I ended up going to Ellensburg, Washington, where, I wasn't, by any stretch, I wasn't going to college. But it happened to be that I went to college almost by accident. And my main focus, though, was on fly fishing, hunting, and the outdoors. And so I ended up going to Ellensburg because everything I wanted was...
In what's there?
Central Washington University.
Gotcha.
So
is that Cle Elum Pass and all that?
Cle Elum is a little bit west of there, but Ellensburg's kind of similar to Montana. It's off on the east side of the breaks of the Cascades.
Gotcha.
And so, anyhow, I end up there and I'm taking geography, and I tried to do more biology and more science, but it wasn't coming together, so I did some geography, and later I ended up, like I said, getting a Master's of Science degree. But moving past that education into the real world of how do you do science and how do we make decisions about our environment and our place and how do we live within this system, I just over time realized that, I've got to figure out a way to communicate not just to myself, but to other people in some ways. What's going on out here in this world? Everything seems to be going pretty fast, and I just felt like photography was going to be the way to do that. So, in a nutshell, as my photography career grew, I felt like I was doing work that was good, but it wasn't quite what I wanted to be doing. I mean, I could go out and take photographs, and I could go shoot wildlife, and I could, but I wasn't sure if the message was getting out. And
so a lot of people would like to do that, but like you somehow found a path to sustaining yourself through that, which I mean, it's incredibly competitive. Yeah. And did you ever think about that it was a very difficult thing a goal to set?
For about 2 seconds. I mean, it was obvious, but this was going to be tough. But for me, it was sink or swim. I had to make a decision in about 2000. I guess it was about 2008, whether I was going to make this a career or I was going to do something different. Mm-hmm. And so basically, because of where I lived and what was going on in my life, I said, well, this is the time to make this happen. I'd already done a lot of publishing and I'd shot photos all over the place. And so there was an anchor there. I had the relationships built.
Right.
And I just felt like it's either going to happen or it's not. And so I started down the path of producing images that I know could sell, right? Like this stuff is as good as anything being done. And at the same time, to help kind of grow photographically, I started doing more conservation photography. I was really interested in telling the story of the land and what's happening out here.
Because you'd already been in natural resources.
Yeah.
I mean, that was the common denominator.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, and conservation, and understanding, that this is sort of a gift in a way. The whole idea of land and open spaces and wildlife, it's like I looked at it almost like it was I couldn't just take. I sort of had to share in it a little bit, and I had to be responsible enough that if I was going to take something, I better figure out a way to either share it or try to be involved in it at a deeper level. And so I started looking at energy. I started looking at people. I started looking at land development. I started looking at just about anything that I could tell a story with through an image. And I just maintain that to this day. You know, I've got, I publish images or I sell images, and I also am hired to take photographs. But the images that I sell, the best images I ever sell are the ones that I feel like have sold the best and that I've made the most money on even, have been images I just shoot from the gut. You know, it's almost like you have to sort of take a step back, sort of defocus your world and just be present in a place. And then try not to complicate your world. Just go out there and, let things happen.
So the question I've always had, and I've followed around a lot of photographers, the question I've always had is how you do that. And, okay, so did you learn the mechanics, the technology of photography? It obviously was evolving pretty quickly when you started. But my question here, I'm having a hard time getting to it, but is how you use the technology and the mechanics of photography to render such a visceral experience for both yourself and then especially to those who are going to share that photo later. How do you do? How is that done? Is that too crazy a question?
No, it's not. And what's the strange thing about it is it's as scientific as photography can be, because it's all about math, really, right? The lenses and the computers and all that stuff that works together is all math. And I took not a scientific approach to it. It's almost like the way I chose to do it is the exact same way I got through college and got through most of my life, was just doing it. Just literally sitting down and going, you know what, I'm going to make mistakes. I'm going to do whatever I have to do and just plow through it.
And your attention span was sufficient to learn the technology because you had a goal.
I had a goal.
Right.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay. And it just takes persistence. I mean, I think the biggest challenge that I see people have today that want to do photography is, for one reason or another, they don't have the time. And so, fortunately, in some ways, technology's helped to kind of narrow the gap between how much time it takes to learn the technology and how much, effort it takes to get a good image. But at the end of the day, it's all about being there and doing something. I mean, you can't just sort of, I like to say this, and I've said this in many times in interviews, even when it comes to like, how do you know when you're doing something right or you're getting good? And I like to make an analogy with Tiger Woods. And I saw a commercial a number of years ago when he was bouncing a golf ball on the end of one of those sticks that they hit the ball with, a club, and he was bouncing that ball, and then he hit it one time up a little higher, and then he swung at it like a baseball bat, and he rocketed that little ball. And when I saw that, I thought, that is what you have to be able to do with a camera in order to produce, because you got to let that part of the whole sort of world of photography has to come at you without thinking, right? You can't think about any of the obstacles, which are the lens and the camera and all the switches and buttons and all that stuff. And frankly, I can't even figure out how to hook my TV set up, right? So, but I can figure this camera out.
And I always wondered about that with you, because I'm very non-technological, and when you and I are making trips and stuff, you're pretty non-technological until it comes to that realm.
Yeah. And that was the way I looked at it in my head, though. It's like, when I pick that thing up, I really got to know what it does. And the only way for me to get there, now you might be different. Somebody else could pick up the manual and they could say, well, this does that. It was the only way for me to get there was just to do it over and over and over and build sort of a formula. I got to the point where I could pick up my camera and set the camera up to take a photo without looking through it. I just would look outside and I would know, well, I'm going to have to do this, this, and that, and I could take a picture. I wouldn't even need the numbers. And so that, to me, helps from the standpoint of eliminating all the process and allowing your brain to focus on the subject.
Right.
That's the key.
Right.
And if you're fumbling around trying to figure out how this works, or is it going to work, and does that do this and does that do that? By the time you're sort of through with that, you're sort of powder's done. You burned it.
You burned it, yeah.
And so you kind of missed it. So anyway, that's kind of a long story, but the point is if you're going to do something and you want to do it well, is to understand what your tools are and be able to use them. And that's really, it's simple.
And so what advice would you give somebody who was, say you're a backcountry hunter and you want to take a few great pictures on this trip that you may do? Well, you may do it every year, or you may never do it again. We all know how that works. How would you, what do you have an advice for somebody who's moderately engaged?
Well, with today's technology, it's a little more simple, but I think if you were going out and you wanted to sort of bring back some images that you could be happy with and show your friends and that sort of thing, is my starting point and my philosophy on photography, as I said, is sort of just do it. But it's also to focus on the subject. If people would just think about what they're taking a picture of, get some light on it, however it is, if it's the sun shining on their face or whatever it is, look at that image and sort of try and relax enough that you understand what you're taking a picture of. If it's a guy with a gun or a guy with a deer or a guy hiking on a trail, there is a story in that photo. Okay. Somewhere there's a story. And if you sort of add too much, you lose it. In other words, there's a guy walking down a trail and there's a mountain. If you can try to figure out how to tell the story of the guy walking to the mountain without throwing in the bushes and the trees and all the rest of the crap that's around you.
Getting it too busy.
Yeah, too busy. Just focus in on and it's that simple. Ask yourself, what am I taking a photograph of? And just in doing that, what you do is you kind of force yourself to really focus on something.
Okay.
And then take the photograph. And you know what? 9 times out of 10, that image is going to work because you've done that. And if you're just out there sort of willy-nilly taking pictures, you've got to keep in mind that if you want to look at an image later on, you have to realize that no one else was there, right? In other words, you're showing somebody a photograph. They're not there to smell it, taste it, feel it. There's none of that stuff applies. So try to just narrow it down to, whether it's putting a person on a mountain or putting a deer on a hill, or, try and tell the story and wait until it happens. In some cases, make it happen, but pretty much that's what it is for me. And
there's the old adage of, I can't remember what the f-stop was, and then be there.
Yeah, I think it was either F11 or F16 or something.
And be there.
Yeah, and be there.
Yeah, and that was the old climbers. People say, how did you get that rock climbing shot, Yeah. I think it was, well, we were rock climbing,
Yeah. Well, you're there.
Yeah, you're there. I know you've done in the last year or so, I've been trying to keep up with you. You're in Spain and Zambia. Where else other than, we're going to talk about the big project in eastern Montana and Idaho too, but, and then Alaska every time I seem like I'm looking for you, that's where you're at.
Yeah. Travel is another obstacle, or you can look at it. I say obstacle because it's a whole nother mindset. It's a whole nother way of doing business and traveling around the world. Wow, it's pretty incredible. Spain was recently I was in Spain with a friend of mine named Tom, and we were filming a TV show there, and largely on some of these international projects, I'm either there with a crew of people, or we're filming a TV show, or we're trying to do something to tell a story in a video, and a lot of times I'll take still images.
Sure. What's the story in Spain?
It was a story really about hunting and conservation in Europe, because I've been to Europe a number of times, and basically it's a little bit different, obviously, in Europe how they hunt. And there are a lot more intensive management going on in that part of the world. And so the story was, in this case, was chamois. I think we were hunting chamois, and we were hunting ibex. And the story around the wildlife there is important because they have sort of, in some ways, I'd say, ruined their wildlife over time, shot everything out, privatized everything. And in the case of the Bassetti ibex, the numbers were down to next to nothing. It's kind of like our elk story in North America. Numbers were down next to nothing, and they've been able to bring those numbers back. And there's these Bassetti ibex are all over the place now. So how do you maintain a system, manage a system that's as old as the one in Spain, and still have free ranging wildlife and hunting?
Right.
And that's what we were doing is
Gotcha.
hunting with Bruno Rosich, and it was fantastic to go through that part of the world and look at where these animals live, how people live with them, and how they've been able to bring those numbers back now to where there's a hunting season and people can go hunt these animals. It's tremendous. It's like I said, it's similar to our elk story.
Sure. I think that I saw a whole nother aspect of what you do in your art through, like, I was really fascinated with the pictures of villages in Spain, because I've never been there. And then the people photos that you brought back from Zambia, of course, are in a whole nother. I just find those to be an entrance for me into an entirely different world. It made me want to go and see it myself, which is a mark of success, I guess, on any image. You'd have to say, I have to try to experience that. And I would love to see the kudu, and I would love to see that thorn country. But those isolated peoples that's deep, a deep study, man.
Yeah, it's great. I mean, the people are, amazing. And the one thing I've noticed wherever I've been is that generally people are really looking for the same thing, whether you're in Spain or France or you go to South America, or, it doesn't matter where you go. Africa, people tend to be looking for the same thing. They want a little bit of happiness, and they want some food on their table, and and you can water it down to the bare minimum. It gets pretty real pretty fast. Makes you realize. And one of it's odd, but one of the things that at least in this last trip to Zambia was the fact that here you are with $5,000 worth of equipment, and these people that you're talking to and hanging out with and living with, they wouldn't know $5,000. I mean, they've never seen anything near.
It's almost even non-cash, right?
Yeah, it's not even on their radar. I mean, on one hand, and on the other hand, you look at these people, and they're non-confrontational type of people. They just want to get along. They want to have a good time. They want the same things we want. They want to go fishing. They want to go shoot an animal to eat. They want to grow some crops, and so from that standpoint, it's easy to understand them. But the one thing you can be sure of is that unless you've been in some real bad situations in your world, you don't know what it's like to be hungry.
Right.
And when you see that,
one of the things I saw in there is they are low on. There ain't no big beefy folks around, but some of the greatest images to me, and I like the idea of clearing poachers, and like you cleared 5,000 snares or something like that, right?
That's right.
And those guys are so well armed, and they're so intent on their mission. It's a beautiful thing to see that, and that comes through in the photos,
Yeah, I think part of that too is, again, in some ways it's not different than men in other parts of the world. They want a job. They've got to focus. Give them a mission, and they accept it. You're not going to stop them from doing what they want to do, and it's their place too. Right. So these guys grow up in
their traditional homeland. Right?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And they're looking at this like, wow, here's an opportunity. I got a job. I'm going to make a little bit of money. I'm going to live out in the bush. I'm going to, traipse around looking for people who are trying to destroy my way of life.
Right.
And so it's a
just
job.
For a really short background, they're trying to clear a piece of country that's been all the wildlife's been taken out by the bushmeat trade.
Yeah,
and they weren't the ones that did it.
That's right. And some would, as a rule, they weren't the ones that do it. Obviously, when times are tough and you get desperate, you're going to participate in whatever it takes to feed your family.
Sure.
But the largest majority of the people. They didn't have a lot to do with it. I mean, it's like anything. When you got guys with guns who are doing stuff illegally, you kind of have to either go with it or figure out a way to build something different. Because it's dangerous.
Right.
Right?
Sure.
I mean, you can't just walk around and just tell people what to do out there. You never know who's going to get you in the bush. And
the bushmeat was going back to the city, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And not just bushmeat. I mean, there's another trade there where they cut down the forest, and then they make charcoal out of it, which is a habitat issue, obviously.
Right.
Fishing the same way. Where we were at, they had pretty much wiped out the tilapia, which were a native fish in the rivers and in the ponds around there. That had been pretty much wiped out. And so they had built, some guys had built some fish farms there to help restock the tilapia in the rivers and then provide protein as well. So sort of looking at a whole community and trying to redevelop an economy and in one way bringing back the wildlife helps both emotionally and spiritually. The one place where we were at, they hadn't had their annual gathering for a number 5, 6, 7 years because they didn't have the game. So they would historically get together and have a big get together during the hunting season to honor the animals. Well, they had quit doing that. As a people, they were sore and tired and worn out, and they sort of lost some focus because there's no animals.
Right.
And so that's coming back, though. They're going to have another, I think this year, in fact, it'll be this year that they're going to bring that back. They're going to have animals there to hunt and be able to have a ceremony and live their life. And, those are great success stories, and hunting is part of that.
One of the things that I was so fascinated by in some of that footage was also those drone footages of it, where there are solely people, I guess they are too,
yep.
And they live completely. They have footpaths that do connect to that 1-2 track.
Yeah,
but you don't ever really see them.
No,
right? They're living another kind of life.
Man, we were in this little village staying there, and then there would be people the boys that were doing some work around there would. I mean, literally, you could be driving down a 2-track and people would just be walking out of the bush onto the road. Mm-hmm. And these kids would come to work on their bikes or whatever they could do to get there. And they'd start, in the dark, they'd work an 8-hour day for $2.
Yeah. And
then they'd hike all the way back home, might be 3-4 miles. Every single night there were lions, there were hippos in camp. I mean, the leopards, you could hear the leopards at night. So these guys are walking to and from this job, but they have a job. And they're just, they're super good kids. They want to work hard and they do a great job. And yet, we look at we complain about not having, a vehicle maybe sometimes, or I need a new truck or whatever.
Yeah, I've done it.
These guys are doing whatever they can just to get there. And it's fascinating.
I mean, we spent a bunch of time anguishing over the fact that our tires were too low. We needed new tires the other day. How are we going to get that?
Yeah. So, I mean, that's fascinating. Africa's a neat place. And if you ever get a chance to go there, I'd recommend it and try to get off the beaten path. And, the people are nice. Just treat them well and you're good to go.
Yeah. Well, one of the things that I noticed that came out of that was the intense focus that you use on those people's portraits and on the anti-poaching team and all. And then as I'm coming back to looking at some of your work, we go, and I've been wanting to talk about this with you anyway, then you got that enormous landscape project in eastern Montana and Idaho. And again, I mean, I'm not a photographer. I don't know how it's done. Mm-hmm. I do know that it's a vision that I certainly don't have as a writer and a woods worker. But that project blew me away because I went to some of those places mm-hmm. after I saw your photos. It's the same thing. I had to go and try to experience what I felt in that photo. Mm-hmm. And I know some of that was Missouri Breaks, right?
Yeah.
So can you tell us something about that project?
Yeah, I mean, and this is really an interesting project because if you're a backcountry hunter and you want to get away from the roads and try and kind of have some peace to yourself, maybe a little bit. There are places, in particular in Montana, in eastern Montana. I spent a summer traveling around most of eastern Montana from, say, the Wyoming border clear north into Canada, where we were looking at primarily BLM lands, and these would be characterized as lands with wilderness character.
Right.
And my job was to go out and inventory these places, find them, photograph them, and in every case, map them and find out what is happening on that landscape and write a story about those places. And so let's say, in one area might be one of the criteria is, does it have 5,000 acres or more of unroaded area? And that was sort of the first level of this math project. I say math project because it was all about figuring out dimensions of areas and distances and trying to find these places in eastern Montana that had these unique spaces left where they weren't developed and they weren't roaded. And let's say there were 100 of these areas that I found and that others had looked at in the past. Of that, I think I really focused in on about 20 of them.
Okay.
I looked at maybe 50, but I got down to about 20. And in doing that, all of that data was put together and submitted to the BLM so that there was defense of what is actually on the land. We can reasonably say, I've been there. Here's the photographs. Here's the evidence that this area has wilderness character. Doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to be a wilderness area. The BLM is responsible, not just in Montana, but in Idaho, in Wyoming, all across BLM lands, for knowing what resources they have. Just like they know how much grass they have on a cattle allotment, they need to know how much land do we manage that has wilderness characteristics.
It is recognized as a resource.
Absolutely, a resource.
One of the things I wanted to, I found out in all of that is they took that very seriously too.
They did,
and they did some of their inventories, and I was really impressed with the people at the BLM for doing the right thing on this. Mm-hmm. And they didn't do the right thing because they had to. They were interested too, man.
Oh yeah, and I mean part of that was because I think it was in Oregon where they started doing some of this work a number of years ago. They were sued because they had never done wilderness inventories on a regular basis to determine, do we have areas with wilderness characteristics?
Right.
And they would argue at the time that that's not a resource. Well, a judge later on said, yeah, that is a resource.
Right, and that's a powerful decision.
Absolutely. And you go to eastern Montana, there are no prairie wilderness areas, okay? And so that in and of itself is an important part of this, in that forever we think of, and in the history of the United States, wilderness areas have always been in the trees, up in the mountains, big places that are hard to get to. Well, we don't have any wilderness type areas in on the prairies, and so one of the reasons, or one of the hardest and I think most difficult parts of that project was to try and convince people that just because there's not a tree and you can see for 50 miles doesn't mean it can't be a wilderness area, or that it doesn't have characteristics of wilderness. Mm-hmm. But historically, it's always been in the mountains. And so trying to get your head around that, and the one of the unique things that goes into wilderness characteristics and why I think it's important for just humans and hunters too is solitude. Being able to go to a place that's remote and yet be there and not feel overrun by the world around you. And these places exist. They take a little effort to get there. They take a little bit of research. But from a backcountry hunter and angler sort of approach, if a guy wants to take a map and look at these places, I mean, I'll just tell you right now, figure out where those areas are and go check them out.
Right.
Because that's where you want to be.
I was lucky enough to get some of that in that South Phillips County, the real sagebrush steppe. Mm-hmm. And there are plenty of sage grouse in it where it's working. And you'd go to these places, these deep defiles, these coulees they're not even coulees, they're washes. And you follow them all day. Mm-hmm. And when you come up out of them, you don't have there is no evidence of anybody else around. They're grazed, but there's not that much grass.
Right.
So, and I think were you at Bitter Creek up north?
Yep.
Yeah.
Amazing place.
So years ago, the bitter battle for Bitter Creek was in all the news, like in the 80s. And they were trying to get more protection for it, and the Canadians made a little protected area on the other side where I'm not sure what that's all about, but it's very small. Mm-hmm. But one of the biologists told me that there were mule deer in there that were like 12 and 13 years old, and they migrated from up in Canada back way down. And nobody had ever discovered this because there's so few people looking. Mm-hmm. And that country is super harsh. I got to tell you, it's an unforgiving place.
Sure is.
But not too far to the west of that, of the Frenchman's. And then there's one called Snake Creek and Rock Creek, which have a lot of private land. Mm-hmm. And that's one of the biggest waterfowl places that I've ever seen. I got to go there in April. And they're all traveling. It's through this hugely unpopulated piece of the world. Mm-hmm. I've never really, it's almost as if the reality is different there. And it is completely inhospitable to long-term plans of human beings.
Yeah. The people that make a living out there are tough.
They're super tough, and they know where the grass is, and they know where the water is, because you can have grass, but if it's 3 miles across to the next water hole, you still can't use it unless you've got real cowboys to push every day,
Yeah. And, one of the other cool things I think about, in particular eastern Montana and some of these big areas is the potential for exploration. Maybe that was one of the things that as a young person, that helped me, gravitate towards making a living in the outdoors in whatever way I could in resource management, was the exploration. You can go to these places and wander around and find things that, everybody likes to talk about hunting arrowheads and that sort of thing. I've never really been real big on that, but the geology and the sort of the natural wonders, and in such an extreme environment, those extreme environments tend to be the places that have the most dynamic. You can go to a forest somewhere and you feel like there's lots going on there, but it ain't nothing like the prairie. I mean, right. the difference is just amazing. It seems like nothing's out there, but in Montana, the prairies have more birds than any place else in the country. It's all happening out on the prairie. And so being able to go explore that in such a harsh environment, whether it's in the wintertime or whether it's in the summertime, it's not anything like the woods. And I remember one time I was when I was living in Washington, D.C., I went to New York City for a meeting in Manhattan. And, part of the whole deal living back there is experience in the city, because I'd never lived in a big city like that. And so I went up to New York City and I was talking to some folks there at a bar about Montana and about the West. And these two gals were telling me their story about Montana. And the one girl says, I am never going back to Montana. And I'd never heard anybody say that before.
Right. That's a whole new take on it there.
Never crossed my mind. Like, wow, I got to hear more about this,
Mm-hmm.
And I says, well, what's the problem with Montana? She says, well, when we got out to Montana, I felt like I was going to fall over. I just never want to go back. Mm-hmm. So these people live in a city where there's just walls everywhere and they feel comfortable in that setting, but they get out in this wide open place and it's such a difference between the way they live that they're uncomfortable being there. And
a friend of mine from D.C. once told me that the space, the sheer volume of the space exhausted him by the end of like the middle of the afternoon trying to bird hunt. And he said that I find myself exhausted by the sheer amount of space.
Yeah, and I kind of feel the same way about going to new places like Manhattan. Like just the volume of shit going on there is unreal.
Yeah.
Like you can't even get your head around it. And yet I can go out to the prairie and I can, that's one of the neat things. You can just take off and go. And then, like the exploration part, for me is what's really cool. And you're trying to figure out that environment. And you mentioned Idaho, and I did spend some time in Idaho on a similar project this summer to really photograph some of these areas that, the big thing right now in wildlife management and conservation in the Mountain West is connectivity. Trying to make sure we've got enough property sort of managed well enough that animals can move, laterally and horizontally and up and down and all around, so they're connected.
You bet.
And so that was.
So you don't get what David Quammen wrote about that island geography where everything is on a downward spiral.
That's right. And I think that's where the push is now, looking at public lands and BLM in particular in these areas, is those corridors that we now know exist. And even in some cases, even 10 years ago, we didn't know that. We kind of just took it for granted, or I don't know what the deal was. We just thought, well, you see deer there, so there's deer there. And then, it's like, well, yeah, but those deer were 100 miles over that way.
Right. Remember that 2012 was the first time they found out those sage grouse left that southern Canada and went to the Missouri Breaks?
Yeah. Antelope.
Just because of that incredible winter.
Unbelievable.
Yeah.
And so being able to be involved in a project like that, and my goal was to go photograph those areas so that the images could later be used by conservation organizations to basically help tell stories about these places, with the idea that people might appreciate them a little bit more, understand their value a little bit more visually, like this is really, that's part of the story. It's not the whole story. I mean, you're not going to go take a picture of someplace and just protect it forever because of the picture, but it's part of the story. When people don't know what they're looking at, it's kind of hard to convince them.
I have a question for you. Have you ever looked at Evelyn Cameron's work, the frontier photographer from around Baker?
Yeah,
Montana?
A long time ago.
Okay, so they found all of her slides in the basement.
She was like around the turn of the century or something.
And for sure. They were from England. Mm-hmm. Her husband was going to make a fortune raising polo ponies on the frontier. And she ended up chronicling, they were broke. In fact, one of their remittance checks from her estate in England was sunk on the Titanic. And that really they had no money. Zero. The homestead didn't make money. She would sell eggs one at a time. I mean, they were in it. Mm-hmm. And she met a photographer in Miles City and began to do this cutting edge new wave photography in 1900. But I'm going to get you the book when we get home, because she wrote about the near impossibility of photographing the prairie. And she said, I have boxes of images that look like nothing.
Right.
And she said, and yet when I stand there, I feel this so intensely, and I cannot photograph it. And she talked with other people about this, but she was actually the only person really doing it. They were in the Terry Badlands, and that worked sort of, because there's big hoodoos and there's erosion gullies, and but she said, I cannot. This became her obsession. Yeah, was to translate the power of the landscape onto an image. And she said, I look at them, and it's just a piece of grass.
Yeah, there's one of the quotes I have in my office even, and I use it often, is from Elliot Porter, who was a photographer, rather well-known photographer. He said, there are things you can photograph and there are things you cannot photograph. You just have to do it. Mm-hmm. And
to know.
Yeah. Right. You won't know otherwise. Okay. And that is exactly the way that part of the world is. You get out there and it's you look at it and you when you're there, it seems remarkable. But then you take a picture of it and you're like, this is telling a story, but it's not something you're going to see hanging up at REI with some guy hanging off a cliff, or it's not what we think of as wilderness or wild. It's sort of like, it's just BLM land, right? Right. And it's so much more than that. And to sort of wrap the resource and the political side of that up a little bit, in looking at those areas, the people that live out there truly value those places. I mean, they love those places.
That's deep home to a lot of the people I know out in that part of the world, and they have generations. Right. They may have a different view of it than we do as outsiders, for sure. But I remember a woman there told me, she showed me this green ash tree that was growing up through their deck, and she was trying to explain their long history there. And she said, we planted trees here. Her grandparents planted trees there. And she said, we finally found one that could make it. Mm-hmm. And man, it was metaphor too for her history there, because there wasn't anybody else. They were the folks who had a lot of their buildings were buildings that had been dragged from collapsed homesteads long ago, right?
Sure.
They had witnessed the exodus of the people who couldn't make it.
That's right. Well, there's still...
I had nothing but admiration for all that.
I think people are still leaving that part of the world to go to find different places to be, I think, and find jobs and find work and that sort of thing. And, I try to support those communities. I try to support those people. I mean, there's a fear that, that the government's going to come and take everything. And I think we have a job to do to talk to people and understand where they're coming from and realize that, for me, I feel like that part of the world it's almost like there is a lot of public land. We should be able to go there and experience that. But I don't feel like we want to overdo it either, because there's something about it. There's something about those people doing what they do. I don't want to get on their bad side. I don't want to make them nervous. Right. But at the same time, we got to know what we got out there. It's ours. It's everybody's. We can go participate a little bit and go hunting there and try to respect the place. And I feel like that's when it is public land. I can be there just like you, but I almost feel like it's important for me to recognize that I'm still a visitor. Mm-hmm. I don't get to go there and just, treat it like a rental. Right.
Sure.
Like when you rent a car, drive it like a rental.
Right.
Not out there. You go out there and you respect the place, and do like the locals would do in some cases. And in other cases, maybe you pick up some trash on the way out. Or
go on one better and
that's right.
And steer it in it. Yeah.
Yeah. Because it's a legacy too. I mean, the public land user is creating a legacy. Some of it's good. Yeah. Some of it's not so good.
And I can tell you one thing I learned traveling that country a lot was you may feel that you're in this vastness of landscape alone, but people who run cattle over that vastness of landscape have incredible optics. And the other day I was with a friend of mine who ranches some big country that it's all open, and these creatures, I guess they were mule deer. They didn't come to my eye right away, right? And he said, there's some moving right there. And he did not have binoculars, and he's old. Mm-hmm. But his eyes were so attuned to anything changed on that. It's a huge piece of ground too. Yeah. That if one time I was parked somewhere looking at maps in Phillips County, and I can't remember this guy's name, but he appeared over from nowhere. He said, "Lost." And we got in this great conversation. I ended up sending him one of my gun books, but he was immediately I wasn't there 25, 30 minutes before the guy who runs the cows there showed up out of the nothingness, apparent nothingness.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
That reminds me of a hunt I was on in Mexico a number of years ago, and we were hunting bighorn sheep, and one of the guys that was on that hunt was I guess he's probably in his 60s. He might have been closer to 70. And he would find these rams in the mountains that nobody else could see. Like it was just, I've been looking at wildlife my whole life. Right. I know how to find wildlife if nothing else. And he was pointing out these sheep, and I'd put my binoculars up there, and it's still, and he not only was he able to spot these animals just by looking at the land, because he'd seen it for so long and so many times, and he was so in tune with what was happening on those hillsides. At his age, if he wanted to really see what that animal was, he carried a pair, and they were given to him. He didn't buy these binoculars. These guys do not have $500 boots and $3,000 worth of hunting equipment. He had a pair of 10 by, or no, they were 15 by 50 binoculars that somebody gave him. Probably real expensive, Swarovski binoculars. They're really nice binoculars. This guy's almost 70 years old, and he's like, yeah. So he puts them up there, and he's telling me everything we need to know about those sheep, and he's almost 70, and I can't hold a pair of 15-power binoculars up to my face to save my life.
They're like those old tank commander binoculars.
Yeah, you're going, you can't see anything through them because you're wobbling around. And so them old guys, I mean, I'm telling you, they live for that kind of thing. And you're out in that country where there's not a lot going on, and people that are from there, they get it. I mean, it's almost like they can feel something happening, and even if they can't see
That's what the guy was the other day. He was. We were actually pumping some gas out of a portable tank so we could put stable in it, and he just looked up. Well, there's something right up in there, and it would never. I would never. Well, for one thing, I never looked up there. He also has like a 750-yard gong out there that he shoots all the time. Like whenever he's not doing something else, he has all different rifles that he'll shoot. And you can see the edge of this if you spend a full week antelope hunting. Your eye will. It's like sharpening a knife. Your eye will eventually. You're starting to see how they perceive the landscape. Those guys who look for a crippled cow way out yonder that may be the margins for this month's paying this month's bills.
Sure,
that's what's driving that. And I noticed I was hunting antelope with my daughter, and we didn't fill the tag, but it was close. And by the end of even 2 days, we were picking up stuff.
Sure,
that the first day would have gone right past.
Oh yeah. Yeah, imagine what it was like 300 years ago when people were living in that part of the world. I mean,
or if you missed it, somebody whacked your head off.
Yeah, exactly. I
mean, that would be an intense incentive for a little landscape study.
No doubt. So, yeah, those kind of projects, though, back to eastern Montana and Idaho, I mean, those things to me, if I could do that the rest of my life, I'd be pretty damn happy. And just being able to get out. I mean, logistically, they're challenging projects.
Right. Well, you were just living out of the back of your truck when I remember that. Yeah.
Oh, yeah. And I mean, the people that you meet, the people that you meet, the things that you encounter, the problems that you have to solve, when you're out doing that kind of work, logistics are really hard. But again, I like to be stressed. If I'm just going to roll into Glacier National Park and roll my window down and take a photo of a sheep on a hillside, that's, okay. But when you put the stress in there, that's what really motivates me. The wind, the rain, the sun, that's the thing on the prairie. If you're out there in the summertime, the sun will beat the crap out of you.
It's relentless.
It is relentless. Yep. And then, one of the neatest things is getting stuck on the prairie in a thunderstorm. With it coming in, you can see it coming for a day, and here it comes, and it just like somebody just opened her up and douched you out, and you're there for maybe 2 days, day and a half for sure, but you're not going anywhere.
Right.
It comes over, it lays down the water, and you're basically going to sit there until it dries out. And
because you can't really move on that gumbo
either. You can't go
anywhere.
You can't drive around. You can't even hike anywhere.
Right.
And again, that's one of those. Those are the experiences as a photographer and as someone who's sort of got a job to do. You get to a different place in your world when you get stuck like that. And you can get stuck. I've been stuck on, we've all, up in Alaska, you get stuck on a mountainside. Just this fall, I was stuck up there we were up there for 2 days and never got out of a tent because it was just constant downpour on the side of a mountain hunting goats. I mean,
Then weren't you weathered in it when I called you? You were weathered in at some little airport for another week, right?
We were weathered in down at this other camp. But when those things happen, it's almost like, that's when the story starts.
Sure.
And the other stuff is cool and everything, and it's kind of what you see a lot of. But getting in those situations where I know going in, particularly say in Idaho, that, I may wind up doing something on this trip that I never thought I'd be doing. And that is part of the exploration. It's part of the experience. And you don't have to be a photographer to do it. You can actually just go and say, I'm going to go spend a week going into these places.
Well, and that's all I did too. I just went to wandering because I wanted to see what I've always been fascinated. I think a lot of people are with the places where nobody else is looking for anything. And when I was a kid in the Southern Cumberlands, I had kind of a mental roster of like places between fields where nobody ever went. And I imagined that there would be a great big whitetail, or, you could you set traps there, or where you would sit in a tree and see what happens in the places where nobody else is looking. You know, it's almost like I got to admit, I was very influenced by like Grimm's fairy tales and stuff. That's what we read as a child, and there was just this element of mystery in landscape, and so. Especially when I came west and went into places in the Bitterroots where, honestly, nobody goes. Maybe one person goes a year in these giant alpine basins where there's nothing else. You know, and the same is true in that sagebrush country in southern Phillips.
Yeah, no doubt. And
you can tell because you'll see buffalo bones and whatnot, and nobody's ever picked them up.
Yeah, and there's lots of places like that still. I mean, you can go find all kinds of bones and historical. I mean, I found more winter-killed mule deer on the prairie than I found anywhere else that I've ever been. And I go places where there are thousands of mule deer.
Is that just because nobody's out there to pick it up?
Nobody's picking them up.
Right.
I mean, because you sit there and you're like, okay, so what are the chances of me finding anything out there? Well, you don't know until you go look.
Right.
And it's sort of like, well, you know, and like you said, I had a mission. And so my goal wasn't to go find a winter-killed buck, but in the process of trying to complete my mission, which is scour this landscape and find out if there's any roads or any development, you run across all that stuff and you start to put that picture together, and it's like, man, there's a lot going on out here.
Yeah.
You know, and so, you know, that part of it, the educational part, the experience, all of that, you know, that's why I think these projects are some of my favorite. Is
I bet.
Where you go out and you just have to make it.
And you're also, it's not you got a weekend or whatever. You've actually got a mission. I mean, you were out for a long time. I remember.
Yeah, 3 months on the Idaho project, and then this last one was only a couple weeks in Idaho. Had a narrower focus on that. I had to cover a lot of country, and fortunately, I kind of knew where I needed to go with some help. Other folks. I mean, that's the other neat thing about these projects is they're not just one person. I mean, I'm out there doing the work, but there's a lot of support out there. There's people who know these areas and people who have been there or people who know how to get there. And, you know, in order to do that kind of work, you need a little bit of help. I bet. Because otherwise you could spend, like in Idaho, I didn't have that much help with that. It was more.
I remember you said that there was a huge amount of just figuring out where it was.
Yeah.
That white bark picture you sent me, was that's up Donkey Hills?
Donkey Hills in Idaho, central, fantastic, beautiful place. And, you know, and in that same area, seeing all the elk that I saw in there and the mule deer and, you know, antelope and, you know, it's one of my favorite places.
Yeah. Well, that image, I've got that thing. It's a giant white bark tree. I would say it's 1,500 years old if it's a day, you know. And when you shot that image and you sent it to me, I wanted that print, which you gave me, which I appreciate. But I hung that print in my house. And my sister's a painter and does some kind of landscapes and does a lot of really intense, like, light in water. And that photograph of that white bark tree in the Donkey Hills, it's so wild. It's so... I don't know how to explain it, really, but it doesn't fit anywhere in that room. It pulls your attention straight to that crazy ancient tree. And so my wife and I were like, where do you put this? And we finally put it, there's my kids' first deer, and then there's that tree, that photograph of the tree. And it'll be interesting, my buddy David, who you also sent one to, who does the white bark work and has for years, he got me into harvesting white bark cones for the Forest Service. I'll be interested to see what he does with that photo.
Yeah,
because it's not an unsettling photo. It's not a weird image. It's just very powerful, and it's of a very powerful like that. That thing has been the storm damage to that tree.
Yeah, it's incredible.
I can't go on and on. So one other thing I wanted to ask you is, do you have favorite images? Or would you ever tell anybody if you had them?
That's a good question. I do, and for some of those, favorite images, I guess I do, and I think that what my favorite images are, it's an interesting story, particularly or question, because from the standpoint of the business of photography and making it, you know, part how I make my living, I have favorite images that earned a lot of income for me, relatively speaking, a lot, not tons, but, you know, more than others, let's say. So in some ways I have a favorite category of these are my favorites because they resonated with people who thought that they should be published and paid money for. What's interesting about that is in the history of my professional photography, outdoors, wildlife mainly, and landscapes, I can send you 10 images, you ask me for a magazine cover, and they say, we want this and that, and we want this and that, and I send you what I got. I'd say 99 times out of 100, they pick something I wouldn't pick.
Mm-hmm.
My favorite images almost are never chosen to do anything with.
Okay.
And so, yes, I have favorite images. They're in categories. But I recognize this. As a photographer, there's a story behind how the image was created. And so for me, one of my favorite images is of a grizzly bear stalking bighorn sheep in the wild. I mean, this all just unfolded right before my eyes. I was up in Glacier Park, and I was up off the trail a ways up on a mountainside, and a grizzly bear comes out, and this bear is going to try and have a meal off these sheep. And I managed to get some photographs looking through the sheep. You can tell what's happening. So it's not the most dynamic, and it's not the most well lit, and it's not even that good of a photograph, but the story behind how it was created and what it took to do that makes it one of my favorites.
You remember seeing it when that bear first showed up?
I remember.
Look at that. Yeah,
it was about a half a second between seeing the bear, seeing the sheep, knowing where I was going.
Yeah,
I am going to get myself in a position to photograph a grizzly bear stalking sheep. Like that, I didn't even think about anything else. That's the great part of that style of photography, that wildlife photography is, for me, I can go to a place in my head where there is one thing happening, and that's it. It doesn't matter how cold you are. It's like everything is sort of just evaporates from your mind, and you're focused on one thing, and it doesn't matter what else is going on. And to me, when I get in that place, I'm sure it's a drug. It's got to be some kind of thing going on.
A boxer would call it flow, right?
Yeah, it's like, man, and the nice thing about it is if you have the time and you can get into those situations where everything else just evaporates, it's freedom. It's like you don't even notice it till it's over, and then you're just fucking worn out.
Yeah,
I mean, literally, you're just like, you got to sit down and take a deep breath and go, holy, and then you sort of start looking around again and going, okay, well, what time is it, and how long have I been doing this, and what do I got to do? And there's nothing else that I can do that takes me to that place. And I can sometimes go out and not get to that place. But when you do, to me, that's the ultimate. Nothing else matters in this world. And it's I guess it's not so much a spiritual thing. It's knowing that you can get to a place where you can literally be in the moment. It's not cliche. It's not, psychological BS. It's literally in the moment, and nothing else matters. And that's cool.
How does when you're doing that kind of wildlife photography, you're having to pay attention to wind, camo?
Some places, a lot of times, like if you go to popular places like Glacier, Yellowstone, I mean, depending on if you're shooting from the road, most of the wildlife near roads is pretty well acclimated to humans, and they're going to just sort of be and do. But in other places, the approach is very important. It's not unlike hunting. One of the things that's different though than hunting is if you want to craft a unique image, you always have to think about the light, and so. While hunting, you think about the light so you can see through your scope, obviously. With photography, there's this as an added element of background and light. And so I've got tens of thousands of images, and you see a lot of photographs on Instagram and everywhere else that are just, people are excited enough just to get a picture of something. Well, take the next step and say, I want a picture of that something with blue sky. Or with, a mountain, or with a specific tree, and then you go out and try to find it, and that's where it gets challenging. It's not that difficult to get a picture of an animal. Now, put it together and tell a story with it, then you've got all those other elements working against you, and weather. So,
well, speaking of all of which in one is there's a famous image to me, probably the image that I most remember when I think about your work, and I've looked at a lot of it, but that bighorn is the sheep hunt.
Yeah.
Is that in the Yukon?
Yeah, those were stone sheep. Those were northern BC, 2 stone sheep in the cave.
And y'all were weathered in there too, right? Yeah. So can you tell me that the history of that? There's going to be a lot of people listening to this and know that image.
Yeah.
If you don't mind sharing the story of that image,
sure. Quickly, it was a classic couple 2-week hunt, I think, and we had a Tahltan Indian guide with us on that hunt in northern BC, and we had been out for, I think this was the 8th day of the hunt. Never mind the 3 days it took to get where we were at on horseback and everything else. But we'd been out, and we just ended up so far away from the horses that by the time the 2 sheep were shot, it was getting dark, and we had to deal with, getting the animals taken apart and processed so we could load them into our packs and get off the mountain. And the option was either try and make it back to the horses, which would have been completely insane because of the way we got there, right? Up and down and through you would not do that at night.
And this terrain is what? Is it big mountains? Is it timber?
No, it's alpine and then timber in the valleys. And so we figured the guide that was there, Jimmy Peterson, it was funny because, guides like to think they've been everywhere on their place. And he wasn't real sure about where we were going to go. He knew with a destination because he knew there was an old camp back over this hill and then down this valley. And if we take the valley down to the creek, we could follow an old trail, and there was an old camp down there. And we set off to do that. Started raining. We got down through this big canyon, and it was plumb dark, and it started raining, and we just he hadn't been there before. And there it was. It was just this big limestone cliff face with a real nice little cave, and there was enough wood there. We just started shaving the branches off the trees for fir boughs for beds, and built that little fire, and pretty much laid down with what we had on our backs. And when I shot that image,
So you had the 2 sheep heads, I remember, and then all the packs.
That's right. So we had shot 2 animals, and when we got to the spot, it just seemed like this is one of those times that separates, for lack of a better word, a professional from just a person taking a picture. At this point, you better earn your keep, because I'm there to take photographs. This is one of the most epic parts of this whole adventure. And I've got to figure out how to take a picture of it. So I just thought, well, we got to take every bit of light that we have. We got a fire. We got a couple headlamps, and it's plumb dark because it's cloudy and it's raining. So we don't have much to work with. Move the heads around a little bit, put the guns up there. Everybody was kind of in their spot. And
people are exhausted too. That comes through in the photo.
Yeah, we'd been gone all day, and that's what I'm saying about being a professional. It's like you got to push the one extra limit, because I wanted to be laying down, and I just wanted to just shut her down. And it's like, I'm going to get up and do this, and we're going to make it happen. I sort of framed the shot. We turned on a couple of headlamps and put the sheep on the rock there, the heads on the rocks, and threw some wood on the fire. And I remember looking through my camera going, this is either going to work and I'm going to get one, or they're all going to be shit, because it was beyond the limits of the technology. And so I just shot what I could. The handheld, I just sit there and I just put my camera on as fast of wind as I could. I could take as many photos as possible, one after another in repetition. And I locked everything down as best I could, holding my hands up to my chest and looking through my camera. And I just started blazing photos, because I knew that luck would have it, I'm going to get 1 or 2 that might be in focus. The rest are going to be blurry. And I shot 150 or 200 frames and ended up with a couple of shots that had enough detail and were sharp enough to make good images.
Yeah.
And that to me, is kind of a lesson too, is, you know everything you need to know, but then you get to the point where the best images are made are on the margins. We're going past the technology. There's not enough light to do this. These things weren't made to do this. and I'm going to make something happen.
Right. That's a fascinating idea, too. I mean, that's carrying it. I think that I think it was Tony, who told me, showed me that image. And something he said, this photograph could be at any point in human history back to like the mammoth hunters.
Mm-hmm.
That somehow that this one image resonated through all of the history of human beings as hunters.
Mm-hmm.
It's taken shelter with fire, with meat.
Yeah. And it was totally real. I mean, that's the neat thing about that shot, and that whole event was unplanned. I mean, in as much as you can plan any kind of hunt like that. I mean, the fact of the matter is you're not going there to lay on a couch. So you're going to get stressed.
There's extremity. As extremity is a given.
That's right.
Yeah.
And so it wasn't even like, well, this would be cool. I got an idea. Let's make this happen, and then we'll get on our way.
Right.
It was, this is happening now because we don't have another choice. When the sun comes up in the morning, we've still got to hike our ass down through the bush, crossing the rivers, find this old camp. The part I didn't tell you was there was one guy with us who he was an Aussie. He'll slap me for that. He's from New Zealand, South Island. His name's Henry. Henry was the guy that kind of drew the short straw to go back to the horses that night. One guy sold out for the horses because we had that Tahltan Indian who was holding, he'd been there, he'd been born in that place. He was 76 years old. He had been holding them horses in their spot all day, from the morning until, so we weren't going to let him camp out all night. So Henry goes back to the horses. The idea was that he would go back, they'd get on the horses, ride them all the way back to base camp, come around the mountain the next day and meet us at this old camp. And as it turns out, that's what happened. And it was funny because we got to the old camp and we were just wiped out. I was sick. I'd actually gotten a cold or the flu or something. And so it was pretty rugged for me getting out of there. And they come riding in, just it was right around noon. It was sunny. The rain had stopped. And there wasn't really much of a trail when they came through. And so here's the guy, the horse, the wrangler. He was first. And I got some great photos of this guy. He was a neat guy. Anyway, he's got a chainsaw carrying a chainsaw, riding this big old 1,200-pound horse, and he's carrying a chainsaw in his arms because they were going through trying to cut trail just to get to us. And they found the old camp. And when I say old camp, I meant it wasn't a camp they were using anymore. It had been an old time camp, and you wouldn't have known it was there unless you'd know the country, right? Mm-hmm. I remember an old camp over there. So that was part of it too. And it was real. I mean, it was as real as the day is long. And I feel like, in that situation, I just knew this is probably never going to happen again. So we got to figure out how to get it captured, and there's other stories. I mean, it seems like about every big trip I go on, there's one of those moments where you're, in Alaska, we got trapped on the wrong side of a river on a hunt like that and ended up getting naked at midnight with a 30-mile-an-hour wind and swimming across the river just to get, literally leaving everything behind. And we went naked, swam the river, because our camp was about 500 yards from where we could get to the other side of the river. We thought, well, we got sleeping bags in camp. We were bear hunting. We left the bear, we left our equipment, cameras, everything we had, including our underwear, and went naked. Mm-hmm. And, again, that's like, well, you're going to do it. We're going to do it. Because the option was to stay there and just get soaked for another 8 hours in this rainstorm.
Gotcha.
So, again, you kind of live for those parts of the story. And the more realistic that is, the better they tend to be. Because it's just grit at that point. That's all there is. Mm-hmm.
Do you think that one of my big soapboxes in this world, and to tie this back, we don't have to tie it back to public lands, but like one of the things was I ran into you at BHA a long time ago or whatever. What brought you to them? Did they find you or did you find them?
I think I found them. I mean, I was struggling for a while, and I still am actually, with trying to figure out where I belong in this whole hunting outdoor universe and conservation. And so I felt like the message that that initially BHA was sending, and I'm not to say they're not sending the message now. I'm just saying initially when I learned of them was through one of their board members, and I thought, and I knew some of the people. I knew some of those guys that were kind of getting around the fire and saying, we got to have a different message. Like something's happening here, and we got to be part of, whether going to be part of this destruction or we're going to try and do what we can to help modify behavior a little bit. And, and I struggled with that. And I remember calling Randy Newberg, years ago, talking about this to him, like, Randy, I don't have a place to belong, man. Like, I can't just be on this side or that side because I'm somewhere in the middle. I can't be an extremist one way and forget my roots on another. Like, it ain't working for me. I don't have a home. And so I felt like, at least with backcountry hunters and anglers, their core was really in looking at habitat and looking at, people being able to, be in the outdoors without the destructive nature of mechanized world.
Right.
And so that's
which we all have to live in most of the time anyway.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And it wasn't. The hunting message was important to me too, because I felt like there was this real disconnect between the wilderness sort of society folks who, as it turns out, having worked on some projects now with the Wilderness Society directly, you'd be surprised at how many people that are members of the Wilderness Society are hunters.
Right.
A big portion of them. And some people you would never expect. And so that part of it was like, this is one place where I can sort of cross the boundary here. I can take conservation and I can take, the hardcore right gun guys who oftentimes seems like they want to, they just want to have a road somewhere and sort of cross that over and say, you know what? We have more in common than we have differences. And I can talk to you guys about that. I've been on both sides of this issue, all three sides and underneath it. And so that's what drew me to BHA, was the fact that, we're a group of people who believe, in having a clean, healthy environment. And every single member, I would say without a doubt, also respects and understands that we need resources to survive and live. This conservation idea that, it's here, we can utilize it, we got to take care of it, but we got to have some fuel. We got to be able to do a little hunting and that sort of thing. And that seems reasonable. As long as you're willing to stay, and I don't know how many people are, as long as you're willing to say, sit down across the table from me and say, people are part of this earth. We have been here for a long time, and we've been pretty much everywhere there is to go. You can't just say, well, let nature be nature, because we're part of that. And so, to me, right up front, I acknowledge, and I hope you do and others, that we're part of that system. Right. We can either pretend that it doesn't exist and just say, wow, we can't go there anymore, or we can say, no, we're going there. We just better figure out a way to make it work.
Right. To me, it was, we've talked about this on other podcasts too, is like when, as a hunter, you're an inhabitant to the max. And that doesn't mean you can't be a wilderness hiker and not hunt and not be but you're kind of a visitor compared to a person who goes in, stays, takes meat, lives on the terms of the country. Again, the non-motorized sort of approach. But, there were some of the things, and it's not different than that, was that it was the adventure part of it that brought me into BHA. Was the recognition that that extremity was welcomed, and then there was a big bunch of younger people finally in conservation, and I had done so much reporting, and I think of Ravalli County Fish and Wildlife, I think of Russell Country Sportsman, those incredible conservation groups, these old core conservation groups that have done so much for Montana, and I'm like not a young blood at all. And I'm the youngest person in the room, So when I came to BHA, I saw the embrace of like hardcore backcountry adventure in a sort of the way that we used to do it with rock climbing or backcountry mountaineering. And now it was in with a place that I totally understood, which was all the hunting. And it's definitely a different constituency of people, intellect, because there's something about the hunting world which is a little bit more pragmatic. You know,
Yeah.
And they do understand, like I come out, you and I've talked about this for forever. I mean, I come out of it. I worked in logging and I worked in thinning and all that stuff. And in a way, I think that gives me a unique, I left Alabama from working for paper companies where I saw the greatest destruction of the environment I've ever seen. Mm-hmm. And in a way, although I've been a logger and would do it again, I'm probably more radical in some ways than even some of the wilderness, the non-hunting, non-consumptive environmentalists, because I've seen the other, I've been a part of it. But there was this place in the middle, which seemed to me inherently sane, that when I went to BHA in Denver, and I looked at all those old outfitters, and I realized there was no polarities of politics here, and I just kind of totally relaxed.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think part of that has to do with BHA and the members. I think share in a desire to make a model of wildlife management and existence work. The model of you can call it the North American model. You can call it whatever you want, but the idea that people who have whatever means they have can still participate in what arguably is the model for most of the rest of the world and how we manage wildlife. We do that in the United States in a way that almost no place does. Either because they don't have the opportunity anymore, and that's one of the principles that I live by when it comes to thinking about resources and management and hunting is, decisions that I make today need to be, number one, educated. I need to know something about the subject, but to keep our options open. Mm-hmm. Looking down the road at what's in the future, keeping our options open.
Right.
And if we can maintain some level of agreement, if we can all agree that we want to be able to have some remote and wild places where wildlife sort of live on their terms still, and that goes from Alaska and the Yukon south down into Mexico. If we can maintain that, we've got a chance to pass that sort of a legacy on to people that we don't even know, and we don't even know what they're going to look like.
Right.
But if we go ahead and bust that apart and just because we want to mine it or drill it or take it all, that option doesn't really exist in any foreseeable future.
And I can tell you this, from this, I've been super lucky in my ability to travel and wander and look at things and talk to people who are smarter than I am, who know things. And you know what? That exists right now. And if we don't lose it, people have a misguided idea of how much we've wrecked. We've wrecked a lot, but how much is still there that you can go to and see. That thing you're talking about into northern Mexico to Alaska, that exists.
Mm-hmm.
It's basically like it's patting us on the back, going, "Hey, man, don't mess it up."
The environment is pretty resilient. I mean, there is a level of impact that we can have here, and so, it's just that how long lasting is it? I mean, you've worked on reclamation and
lots. Yeah,
you can go to places that they are what we'll say nuked. Like this is not going to be habitat of any real significance for at least a millennia. It's going to take a while.
And that's given our commitment to trying to get it started back.
Right.
Yeah.
And so if we can do things that live within some means of that, we can disrupt systems a little bit. But as long as we're not dismantling it to the point where it doesn't function, like taking a gold mine, for example, and the material that leaches out of a gold mine hard pans the river that flows into another river that flows into another one. I mean, the benthic matter of a river is the soul of that place. If you wreck that, everything above it's gone too.
Well, I don't know what the final tally is, but I live right north of that Mike Horse complex that blew out and wrecked the Blackfoot River back in the day, and they have been fixing that it's an ongoing project. I know people working on it. It takes forever, and that's the benthic headwaters of the Blackfoot River, and those headwaters are in that Mike Horse complex. Sadly enough, right? That's where the gold was.
Never mind that in some cases we got to drink the water.
Right.
I mean,
well, that's the Basin Creek where I used to work there in Boulder, Montana.
Yes.
And that was the Basin Creek mine. And I just I mean, perhaps we come to a new place of understanding, where in a way, as a species, we come back to a place where we were long ago. I wished I could quote the T.S. Eliot poem, that at the end of all our wanderings, we arrive at the place where we began and see it in a whole and different way. And I think that's what I'm looking for.
Yeah, well, I feel like everybody has to own some of it, and my ownership in it is a commitment that I made a long time ago to, try to raise my children, not necessarily as fanatic outdoors people at all, but exposing them. I mean, if you can expose these young children, and mine included, and I have exposed them on numerous occasions to what is it like to be in the bush, and how possible it is to manage that environment, to be in it, to have a good time in it, to be stressed in it. I mean, my children are going to grow up, if they don't ever become, real hardcore outdoor environmentalists, whatever the case is, I can guarantee you when they're 30 and 40 and 50 and on through their life, when they hear someone say, well, we're thinking about taking apart the Upper Missouri River Breaks National Monument.
Right.
They're going to be, whether they're going to go there tomorrow or where they haven't been in 10 years, they're going to remember the dozen trips they took through the monument and say, that's probably not a good idea. And they're not environmentalists. They may not have went to college for it. They don't have what they have is an experience.
Right. And what they could say is that why would I let this place be lesser when I've gained something wonderful from it? Yeah. And to have somebody else just say they're going to take it away from somebody who might appreciate it like that. It just, that whole country, and I know you spent a bunch of time in it on those trips this year. And that's our fishing country. I have never floated that, which is it blows people's mind. I tell you what, we're going to do public lands when I see you next time. Yeah. I've had a great time at this. I'm watching the dogs staring at us through the window. They definitely want something.
Yeah, no, they're doing good.
But Tony, I'll see you back in East Glacier, man, or in my hometown. Yeah, we got 2 weeks left of hunting season.
Yep, I'm getting out. I got to get out and spend a little time out there, and I like to say I take my gun for a walk more than anything. I mean, if I shoot something, it's because I want to.
Well, we had the first week with the horses in the wall tent, and we failed to close the deal on anybody. And both my daughter and my son were with me, and it was a great trip. But we walked forever, and we finally found some. But towards the end of that, it took 4 full days to understand that place. And we had gone to a somewhat new place. We had hiked there, and we'd even fished there before, but we had never hunted there. It took on the 4th day, I started feeling like I knew something, and on the last of the 5th day, we were packing mules.
Well, if you're hunting elk, you're probably going to feel that way forever. I hope.
I think so.
I mean,
too.
That's the thing, right?
Right. I have a fantasy that if I had 2 weeks of unadulterated pursuit time, that I would be somewhere in a 75% ratio every year. But I don't. That's a great fantasy because I usually don't have 2 weeks to prove it.
Right.
I'll see you, man.
Yeah, I appreciate it.
Thanks
Thank
a
you.
lot.